Okay, welcome to part 2 of chapter 20, lymphatic system and the lymphoid organs, because now I am actually going to talk about the lymphoid organs. So lymphoid organs fall into one of two categories. There are really only two, what we call primary lymphoid organs, and that's these areas in the body where our T cells and B cells, shall we say, come of age, they mature. And we'll talk about kind of what a mature immune cell is when we get to chapter 21. But our two primary lymphoid organs are the red bone marrow, which is our origin, right? Because they're talking about lymphocytes, they're talking about blood cells, both the T cells and the B cells, and where the B cells mature, hence bone marrow B cell. The immune cells, or the little proto-immune cells that will become T cells, actually migrate out of the red bone marrow and go to the thymus, which is one of the reasons why our thymus is so much larger when we're a child, because we're getting this kind of huge population of T cells kind of developing. T cells, thymus, T. Right? Love it. I love when it's just that simple, because so little anatomy actually is. And then, so those are our primary lymphoid organs. And then pretty much all of the other lymphoid organs, whether it's the lymph nodes that we find kind of all over the place, the tonsils, the spleen, the appendix, the Pyrus patches, pretty much all of those other things are then what we consider secondary lymphoid organs, and that's these places where we now have mature B cells and T cells, but it's where they're likely to encounter an antigen for their first time and actually become active immune cells to go fight off whatever it is that they've encountered. So we'll start with the lymph nodes, because they're kind of the major secondary lymphoid organ of the body, and we have literally hundreds of them all throughout our body. Most of the lymph nodes we tend to find along the lymphatic vessels, kind of in clusters, but we do have a couple of kind of groups nearer to the body surface, and it's where those collecting vessels merge into the lymphatic trunks, and so you'll find them kind of in the groin area, the inguinal area, so those are inguinal nodes. You'll find them in the axillary area, and then in the cervical area. And if you've ever been to the doctor and they've like kind of palpated your lymph nodes, it's typically going to be one of those kind of areas of lymph nodes. And lymph nodes do a couple different things that other immune cells don't do. Actually, they do one primary big thing that's very helpful for us that other lymphoid organs don't do, and that's they actually filter the lymph. Because the nodes kind of exist along the lymphatic collecting vessels, they work like a big giant sieve to kind of filter out the lymph and kind of catch anything that's in the lymph before it gets kind of returned to systemic circulation. So you'll find both T cells and B cells and macrophages in these lymph nodes, and they help kind of clear the lymph out from debris and anything that could be potentially harmful to us. They also play a role in kind of activating the parts of the immune system, the T cells and B cells, so they can go out and attack something that might be harmful to us. So they have a very pretty specific shape. They are somewhat kind of kidney bean shaped. Like many organs that we've looked at, they have kind of an outer cortex and an inner medulla. So you're looking at kind of the cortex here. This is where we find the lymphoid follicles with their germinal centers. That's where we're going to find primarily B cells. In the medulla, we have what we call cords, which is where the actual T cells are kind of moving through the lymph nodes, but it's actual kind of cell existence. And then the sinuses, or medullary sinuses, are kind of just spaces through which the lymph can move. We do find macrophages a lot in the medullary sinuses, Because as the fluid is kind of moving through them, the macrophages can kind of say, hey, that's something harmful, and kind of grab it and get rid of it. So the afferent lymphatic vessels feed into the lymph nodes, and the efferent lymphatic vessels come out of the lymph nodes at the little indentation or the hilum. And so we kind of have a lot of flow coming in and a little flow coming out. What this does is essentially kind of stagnates the flow, right? Again, think about traffic. If you've got 4 rows of traffic merging into 2 rows of traffic, you're going to get kind of stuck there for a while. In traffic, it's an awful thing, and it makes you want to scream and tear out your hair, but in your lymph nodes, it's actually an excellent thing, because having that kind of really slow flow through the lymph node, through the afferent vessels, into that kind of subcapsular space, and then into the smaller sinuses, then into the medullary sinuses, and then finally out those efferent vessels, because it kind of gets stuck there, it gives the lymph cells, the lymphocytes, and their macrophages like a whole lot of time to kind of do their job, and filter out and kind of clear up the debris that might be in our lymph. The spleen is the largest of your lymphoid organs. Of course, it has a huge blood supply, right? You get that gigantic splenic artery branching off the aorta. That's what serves it, brings it oxygen and nutrients, and then the splenic vein drains it then into hepatic portal circulation. The spleen is a very multifunctional organ. Lymphocytes proliferate here. It's because it's got this kind of huge blood supply. It's a really good chance that the lymphocytes might encounter some sort of foreign antigen, but it also then plays a role in kind of recycling some of our kind of older blood cells and platelets, and some of the debris that kind of gets into our circulatory system. And so it does all of that for us, and it also breaks down and stores, when we break down a red blood cell, that kind of gets stored so that your body can reuse it later. So it stores platelets, it stores monocytes. It's full of lymphocytes, it's full of macrophages. Of course, it's got a huge number of erythrocytes, red blood cells, because it's kind of where they go to die. The interesting thing about the spleen, or one of the most interesting things about the spleen, is that we actually think it might be where red blood cell production, erythrocytes, erythropoiesis, actually takes place in a fetus. It's going to stop before birth, and then it's going to be primary lymphoid organ, red bone marrow. But it's a very interesting kind of additional function of the spleen. So the spleen has a little capsule around it, and has what we call trabeculae. The lymph nodes have these trabeculae too, and I'm sorry I didn't mention those earlier, but they're basically kind of indentations of the capsule, and the cortex part, that basically divide the spleen up into all these sections. And in each section of the spleen, you're going to find 2 very distinct histological areas, both in terms of how they look and how they function. If you look at your big kind of splenic artery here, you'll see that branching off the splenic artery are all these little arteries that we call central arteries. And around each central artery, and that's what we have here, is a central artery. Central artery is what we call the white pulp. And the white pulp is mostly reticular fibers, and it's where we're going to find the lymphocyte in the spleen. So the white pulp mostly functions in the immune part of the spleen functions. Pretty much everything else that isn't this kind of immune area around the central arteries is what we call red pulp. And red pulp is in the sinuses, in the cords, pretty much everywhere that's not kind of clustered around one of these central arteries in the white pulp, and that's where we're going to find the macrophages. It's where we're going to find the kind of bits and pieces of worn out red blood cells. It's where we're going to find any pathogenic substance that might have come in here via the splenic artery, and it's really more responsible for not the immune functions of the spleen, but more of the erythrocyte recycling parts and functions of the spleen. So they look very different functionally. They look very different structurally, and are very different functionally as well. Then we get into what we call the mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, or MALT. And so here we're talking about in the mucous membranes, in the GI tract, in the urogenital tract, in the respiratory tract, that we find these collections of lymphoid tissue kind of scattered throughout the mucous membranes, in all of those mucous membranes that I just mentioned. But especially the kind of the biggest collections of these are the tonsils in the oral cavity, the Pyrus patches in the small intestine, and the appendix. They are still in the respiratory tract and in the urogenital organs, but the biggest kind of collections of them are associated with the GI tract. And that's because since the GI tract is a major source of stuff coming into our body, it makes sense for us to have a large collection of lymph cells in this area of the body. So we're going to start with the tonsils. Again, we're up here in the oral cavity. They're quite simple little lymphoid organs. You'll see them in lab, and they're mostly just collections of lymph cells. The tonsils get named kind of to where they're located. So the palatine tonsils are the ones here at kind of the oropharynx, or not quite oropharynx, kind of separating the oropharynx from the oral cavity, kind of way back here. The lingual tonsils sit right behind the tongue, and then the pharyngeal tonsils are the ones up here kind of at the top of the oropharynx, nasopharynx area. And if you've ever heard the term adenoids, that's another kind of term for the pharyngeal tonsils. Those are the ones that I had removed when I had my adenoids removed when, I don't know, I was like 6 or 7 or something like that. And so if we have something potentially pathogenic in either the food we eat or in the air that we inhale, the tonsils are kind of the first kind of set of lymph nodes or some lymph tissue that could potentially encounter this thing that might be bad for us and get rid of it. They don't have a capsule, or they're not a complete capsule like the lymph nodes and the spleen. They do have germinal centers and follicles like the lymph nodes. The rest of it is kind of scattered with all kinds of other lymphocytes. But they do have this very interesting kind of structural feature called a crypt. And it's basically the epithelial tissue kind of around the tonsil kind of indents and makes these kind of places where bacteria basically get stuck. And so it allows the lymphocytes then in the tonsils to kind of eat at that kind of trapped and stuck bacteria. So pretty handy little feature in terms of keeping us safe. When we're looking at kind of the other kind of MALT area, we're talking particularly the Pyrus patches in particularly the small intestine. Again, this is where most of our, particularly the ileal part of the small intestine, this is where most of our absorption of our foodstuffs takes place. And so it really makes sense to have this collection of lymphoid follicles in the submucosa of the small intestine, because anything that is absorbed with our food that could potentially be bad for us, before it even makes it to the blood, it has to kind of pass this wall of Pyrus patches. We also find aggregates in the appendix, right near at the kind of attachment point of the small intestine to the large intestine. where the cecum, they attach actually to the cecum. For the longest time, the appendix was what we considered a vestigial organ, kind of a holdover from our evolutionary ancestors. You can live without it, and that's largely because its role has been filled by other parts of the immune system. We actually now know that the appendix is one of the kind of major areas fetally when you're in utero, when a human is in utero, where they have a pretty active immune system. And so your appendix actually helps keep you safe and healthy as a fetus. Both the Pyrus patches and the appendix and the lymphoid follicles within them, they can kind of eat at bacteria. They can kind of prevent anything that might be potentially harmful to us from actually even getting into the blood, from breaking open the intestinal wall and causing problems that way. And because they're lymphocytes, they can generate what we call memory cells, which are these kind of holdover lymphocytes that mount what we call a secondary immune response. And we'll talk more about memory cells in chapter 21. And that is, lastly, we have the thymus. And the thymus is particularly important when we are children. It's very large in size and actually gets bigger throughout childhood. But then when you hit adolescence, it kind of stops growing and then eventually atrophies. It doesn't go away completely. Adults still have a functional thymus. It's just a lot smaller. And that's because we still need mature T cells, and we still get lots of them from the thymus, but we don't need quite as many of them as we do kind of through the developmental process. It is fully encapsulated, unlike the tonsils, and like the lymph nodes, it has both a cortex, outer and inner medulla. The cortex is where we're going to find all of our immune cells and our macrophages, and then the medulla, we still find some lymphocytes, but not as many, but we find these what we call thymic corpuscles. And this is really some of the cells that produce the different hormones like thymopoietin that really help our T cells develop properly. And as we'll talk about in chapter 21, without functioning T cells, we really don't have a functioning immune system. And so the thymus is really, really quite important. It is slightly different from the other lymphoid organs in a couple of kind of significant ways. It doesn't have any B cells, so there are no follicles, no germinal centers, and it also isn't like a surveillance site. The T cells that are in the thymus are unlikely to encounter an antigen here. So the thymus doesn't really play a role in fighting the antigens, fighting kind of whatever it is that might be damaging to us. It is really, really mostly about getting the T cells to mature. Again, because those T cells are so very important. Similar to the blood-brain barrier, you also have a blood-thymus barrier. And so the blood supply to the thymus and the capillaries in the thymus have lots and lots of tight junctions that really prevent the T cells from getting out kind of early and prevents them from being activated prematurely. And T cells, as we'll see, as I mentioned, are really very, very important in us having a functional immune system. The other thing that's different about the thymus is that it's actually not reticular connective tissue. It's actually epithelial tissue. So their kind of main functional structural component is a little different than the other lymphoid organs. And that's it. That is the end of chapter 20. Pretty short.